When it comes to Lyft and Uber and ride sharing in general, how does public transportation fit in that equation? As you can see, I'm currently driving right now. I'm heading to the gym, hence this outfit and everything. So this is going to be like a fireside chat style video, as I have had some people say, hey Mark, I know you talk a lot about Uber and Lyft, of course, and taxis, right? Because you can't really talk about one without talking about the other, kind of the yin and yang of car transportation. But what about public transportation? You never really talked about that. How do you think it fits into all of this? And I gotta say, public transportation, I think, is kind of a very unique curveball when it comes to everything being involved with Lyft and Uber, especially when you look at what's going on in Minneapolis. Now, unfortunately, I will do a video about this next. I'm not happy about it, I gotta be honest. That at least at the exact time of this video, in case you didn't know, there's a huge case going on in Minneapolis where they want to give drivers a minimum wage, as they should be getting a minimum wage. However, Uber and Lyft said, you know what, we're going to pull out. We're leaving Minneapolis if this goes through, and we're not going to be here anymore. You have to find other means of transportation. And unfortunately, what just happened is they decided to push back that minimum wage law until July 1st, at least the exact time of this video. I will do a dedicated video about that. But anyway, I have had some comments when it comes to that. People saying, well, Mark, I know you talk about taxis filling the role of Uber and Lyft or other rideshare companies, but what about public transportation? Here's where things get really, really tricky. Now, I'm going to be honest. I think that public transportation and the means of public transportation and Uber and Lyft, I got to be honest, I think are two vastly different things. I think there is an argument to be said about how Uber and Lyft and taxis could rival each other, right? Because you're in a place, you're willing to spend money to go from point A to point B to get in a private vehicle, a vehicle to yourself, ignoring things like UberX Share or Uber Pool or whatever, or Lyft Line or Lyft Shared. For the most part, 90 or 95% of ride shares happen with you having that vehicle to yourself. Same thing with taxis. And I think there's an argument to debate them, just like if I look at Airbnbs versus hotels, for example, right? There's pros and cons on both sides. I find public transportation is kind of in its own unique category. And I want to say that because I think some people said, hey, Mark, I know you talk a lot about Uber and Lyft versus taxis, but I think, public transportation in Minneapolis could be a huge leg up. I'm going to be honest, I don't know as much about the public transportation there, but that could be a huge leg up to help things and make things better with this whole ride-sharing situation. I gotta be honest, I don't think so. And granted, I may be wrong, right? But I remember, for example, when I was in Boston, the public transportation is pretty big. Here in Los Angeles, it isn't, right? The public transportation here is pretty bad. I'm not gonna lie, I have ridden the bus a couple times here in LA, and I have taken the subway a couple times. The routes are kind of meh. I feel like the bus wasn't too bad, but it's not the way it is in other cities, especially if you look at like New York or Chicago or Boston, right? Which is what I'm gonna talk about. And in Boston, the public transportation is the MBTA, and the slang term is the T. So you take the T to go anywhere you want in Boston. And the pro and con of public transportation, just to say briefly in case you've never taken it before, is one, stupidly cheap. I don't know what it's like now in Boston, but back in the day when I lived there, it was like, I think $80 for, was it 80 or 60 or $80 for a monthly unlimited pass. So you could take the T, bus, and train as much as you wanted to get anywhere in the city. And on top of that, like, so if you didn't have the monthly pass, it was like, I think $2 or $2.50 to jump on and go anywhere you want. That is insanely cheap to go anywhere you want in a city for only $2. You can't beat that. So that's a pro of public transportation. It's also pretty efficient. I guess you could argue that in Boston because the T breaks down a lot. But, it's fairly efficient. It comes all the time, unless it's like a really off hour, but typically it comes every like 10-ish minutes or whatever, right? So, a lot of advantages. The biggest disadvantage, though, I think, if anything, is it's funny, and it's both a pro and a con, is kind of the convenience. One, you have to stop at every stop. It's going to take longer to get to your destination. If I take the T in Boston to go from one place to another, it could easily take me an hour, when in an Uber and Lyft or a taxi, it would take me 15-ish or maybe 20 minutes because I don't have to stop every single time. I don't have to wait for people to get on and off the subway or the bus or whatever, right? All these factors I don't really have to worry about. Another thing, just in general, is being crammed on it. I think that's, I guess it depends on who you ask in terms of like the worst part of it. Some people may say the time. Other people may say, you know what, no, it's not the time. It's the fact that, I mean, I used to take the T in Boston when I was an accountant, and I remember the worst part wasn't as much the time. It was being crammed on a subway like this, with you being packed in like sardines. And there were some days I remember in Boston where like the AC broke on the T, or they just didn't have it for whatever reason, and you'd be sweating, and it was just hot, and it was like stifling. Yeah, so that's, I think, the two biggest things. If I had to say, of public transportation that are the worst parts are the time, definitely extra time, and the second thing, I think, among that, is the fact that you're packed in like sardines. But again, there are pros and cons to both sides. You could argue this, right? But I think what's tricky is when people talk about Lyft and Uber versus taxis, like I said, I think there is a cohesive element to them that makes it a fair debate, that one could affect the other, and one does, and I think, inevitably affect the other. Because if you think about with an Uber and Lyft now, the biggest pros among a bunch of them is, or maybe cons, I guess you could say, but the biggest thing about Lyft and Uber is you have the private vehicle to yourself. And I think also too, the mindset for a lot of people is also the convenience and also the financial aspect. If, let's say, you're really tight on money, public transportation is amazing. If you're not, though, and let's say money isn't as much of an issue for you, or you're like whatever, I don't really care, or let's say you're splitting it with friends, taking an Uber and Lyft can be super convenient for it to pull up right to your house, bring you to wherever you want to go. Yeah, you have to spend more money, of course, than public transportation. But when I look at it, I think the mindset of someone ordering an Uber and Lyft and the mindset of somebody taking public transportation are two different markets. I think that whether it's a convenience thing or financial thing, whatever the case is, I think they're two very different markets. And it's interesting that when I used to drive in Boston, which is a really good example of this, I found that, let's say, in the morning, most people take the T in Boston. I find most people do. The only times I found that people would actually take an Uber and Lyft, and I heard this all the time, especially in the morning commutes, is someone would be like, hey man, I'm late for work. And it makes sense. You're late for work. We all have those mornings. We're running late, and you're like, shoot, I can't take the T. It's going to take way too long. I have to bite the bullet and order an Uber and Lyft, regardless of how much it costs. I got to bite that bullet, right? And so I think because of that, you do have two very separate markets, which brings up this big issue, or not necessarily an issue, but I think unfortunately doesn't solve the issue, that if, let's say, Uber and Lyft does leave an area, like this big talk in Minneapolis, which I don't know what's going to happen anymore. I'll do a dedicated video about that. I'm very frustrated they pushed it back. I feel like the city kind of gave in a little bit. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not trying to be pessimistic, but but the problem is I don't think public transportation solves the need or the problem that Uber and Lyft has fixed. And I think that's why, being honest, in a lot of my videos, I don't think I've ever mentioned public transportation, besides, I think the only time I ever mention it, and all the videos I've done on this channel, I've done a lot, as we all know, the only time I've ever mentioned public transportation is that in Boston, because the T would break down a good amount, especially during the winter time, it was like a gold mine to drive for Uber and Lyft. Because not only would it be snowing out, which means already kind of bad traffic, it would be congested, which equals higher surges, but also the T would break down, which equaled more, because if the T breaks down, no one's getting to work. Or 90% of Bostonians are not getting to work, and that's where you come in as the driver, so that way the surges were like stupidly, as I mentioned before, I could make sometimes 60 an hour when it would snow and the T would break down. It was a gold mine, right? That's the only time I've ever mentioned public transportation, because for me at least, I genuinely look at it in a whole other category. And I think, I do think there's a massive place for it. I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I would have ever mentioned this, or I don't think I'd ever expect myself to ever say this, ever. I'm gonna be honest. But I miss public transportation. Although yes, I take Ubers and Lyfts all the time, and I can take them all the time, and I do, say when I'm going out and I'm drinking and I want to be safe and responsible, or let's say if I'm going to an event, even if alcohol is not involved, it's also nice to not have to worry about parking. That's a huge, sometimes an Uber and Lyft is cheaper than parking and dealing with the hassle of even finding parking and doing that whole thing of driving around. And we've all been there when it comes to parking, right? But I do miss public transportation, which I don't think I never thought I would say that, because in Boston, a lot of people hate the T. It's not like the New York Metro. I feel like the Metro in New York is like, it's 24/7, which the T is not in Boston. It's very efficient. There's a million different routes when it comes to taking, the New York. It's super easy to use, right? When it comes to the Boston T, though, there's a lot of tricky things, and it's sometimes not as efficient as you'd like it to be. But I do miss it, right? I'm not gonna lie. There's something so convenient about taking public transportation, and especially involving the cost. I think the biggest thing, this way I look at it, is you're kind of trading your time for money, because unless you're really doing like a peak morning commute or evening commute, and for me, I work from home, so I guess it's a little different. If I'm going out normally on, like, say, a Friday night, it's usually not that bad at all. It's usually not that congested. So my thing is, I'm spending my time, in a sense, to have a cheaper ride. Like, if, like, say, as opposed to be taking, like I said, 20 minutes to get to the bar, I take an hour to get to the bar, well, I'm only spending $2 as opposed to, like, say, 20 or 30, right? So that's kind of the trade-off, I think. But at the end of the day, I think for a lot of people, when it comes to Uber and Lyft, they're in two very different markets when it comes to public transportation and Uber and Lyft. Now, granted, maybe something will change in the future, to be honest, but honestly, I don't think so. Uber and Lyft, although it does cost more, it's just more instantaneous, and I think that is the benefit of Uber and Lyft. It's more instantaneous. It brings you right to your destination. You have your private vehicle, if you look at it, like you have a private driver to yourself. I know it sounds sometimes kind of weird to say, but I think a lot of people forget, like, it's almost having like a private concierge or whatever, or like, someone driving you, and if you need anything, they can stop and pull over and blah, blah, blah. That's the benefit, of course, of Uber and Lyft. And this is why, though, I want to say that although, yes, I think both are absolutely important, I think in a lot of cities, I think public transportation is very important and very good. They're just two different things. And that's why I probably won't really, unless it comes up in like a very unique way, I probably won't ever do another video about public transportation, but I did want to address it. Because like I said, I have gotten some comments about it, of people talking about it, saying, hey, like, you mentioned taxis, but what about the subway or the bus or whatever? Just in general, they're two very separate things. And although, yes, I think some people might take both, like if I lived in Boston again, if I lived in New York, I would definitely take both. I think they're two very different use cases, which means that with all the crazy stuff that's happening with Uber and Lyft, with all the crazy times we hear about Uber and Lyft and other ride-sharing companies coming into play and taxis and all that kind of stuff, I look at all that as being here and public transportation being in its own category over here.